So firstly, I'd like to say good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Firstly, if I can introduce myself, I'm Rachel Anderson, the Director of Corporate Affairs here at RECCo, and I'll be the facilitator for today's session. So in terms of the purpose of today, we'll be walking you through RECCo's budget for 2024 to 2025, which was published just last week on the 21st of February. Today's webinar serves a really important platform for our engagement with you directly on the budget, and we're going to be using today to make sure that we can address any questions that you have or any initial observations. In addition to the budget matters, during our forward work plan webinar, which we held at the back end of January, and I know a number of you attended that session, we did also sort your feedback in terms of our webinar formats and what you'd like to see from RECCo going forward in terms of our future engagements. You told us that you wanted more interactive sessions with RECCo and also some introductory information for those less familiar with RECCo and our purpose. So today we're going to be taking on that feedback in a number of ways. Firstly, we're going to be hosting 2 Q&A sessions within the webinar today. So rather than just waiting to ask your questions at the end of the session, and I know, listening to us speak for an hour, 90 minutes isn't particularly engaging. We want to change that. So we're going to have 2 Q&A sessions so you can ask your questions throughout. In addition to using the Q&A function within the event itself, so you can type your questions, if you'd rather directly interact with us and the panel during the Q&A sessions, if you raise your hand within the event, we'll ask you to come on microphone. You can directly ask your questions. So there's 2 ways that you can ask your questions today. We've also included an About RECCo slide, and that again was just based on feedback. There are individuals that attend our webinars that are newer to the industry or newer to RECCo, so we wanted to just provide some context in terms of who we are at RECCo and why we're established. Also, since improving REC services is a top priority based on the feedback that we've had across all our engagement channels with you over the last year, we're also going to be using today's session to provide a bit more detail today on our key priority for delivering service excellence over the year ahead. Really importantly, today is about your interaction, and as I said, if you do have questions, please do raise them. There is also an opportunity if you want to follow up with the team after today and speak to us directly on the budget. You can do so, and we'll provide an email at the end of the session today. If you haven't had a chance to look at the budget that we published last week, please don't worry. We're going to be walking you through the key components of the budget today. So if we could just cover some housekeeping points. Please do keep cameras and microphones switched off during the speaker sessions. For those colleagues that couldn't join us today, we will be recording today's session and sharing on our digital channels. So we just want to make sure that the recording's as high quality as it can be. As I said, we're encouraging you to ask your questions. So there'll be 2 dedicated Q&A sessions, so you can ask your questions during those, but type any questions during the speaker presentations if you have them. Also, just a final bit from me, it's really just a polite reminder, and it's just if you're asking questions, and obviously we're encouraging you to do so today, just keep them relevant, and that avoids referencing any other organisations, please. So that's our housekeeping. If we can move on to the speakers for today. So today I'm joined by 2 members of the RECCo's executive team. So we have Elizabeth Lawler as our Chief of Operations Officer, and she's primarily responsible for delivering REC services. We also have Brian, our Chief of Finance and Commercial Officer, who, as you'd expect, is responsible for developing all things budget at RECCo and our supporting financial and commercial controls. So that's the speakers for today. What can you expect in terms of the agenda? So I've already ran through that, but very, very briefly, in a moment, I'll be providing a bit of an overview in terms of RECCo and our purpose before I pass over to Elizabeth, and she'll be giving some more information about our key strategic priority for the year ahead at RECCo, which is delivering service excellence. We'll take a short pause. We'll answer any questions that have come in, and you have an opportunity to raise your hands and speak directly with us before we move on to the main event today and the key purpose that you're all here, which is hearing the numbers for next year from Brian. After Brian's session, we'll do another pause, have another session answering any of the questions that might have come through before we wrap things up, and I'll go over any next steps. So that's in terms of the introductions and some housekeeping point. I guess a little point from me is just I really hope that you find today useful. Like we did at the Forward Work Plan webinar, we are going to be asking for your feedback in terms of how useful you found today, but also asking any feedback which is really important for helping us shape our engagements and our webinar formats with you in the future. So if you can spare just a couple of minutes at the end of today's webinar, Jenny, who's working behind the scenes, will launch a couple of polls for you to answer. So that is the background and introductions. I can't see anyone's got any initial questions. I'm assuming that everyone can see the slides. Okay. But okay, I think we'll get going into the next session, which is providing a bit of context in terms of RECCo. So I wanted to just give a little bit of a refresher, hopefully for most of you, but I think it's really important to emphasise that our core purpose here at RECCo revolves around ensuring that the REC operates in a manner that meets its core objectives. So there are 3 REC objectives here at RECCo, which I wanted to briefly cover. So ensuring the REC operates and evolves in a manner that facilitates the achievement of the mission statement is the first REC objective. And on the slide in front of you, the About RECCo slide, I've put the mission statement that really guides our operations at RECCo and our day-to-day activities. So very briefly, that mission statement is around facilitating the efficient and effective running of the market. And we do that through promoting the likes of innovation, competition, and delivering consumer outcomes. The second REC objective that I wanted to highlight is ensuring customer interests and data are protected in the operation of the REC. And then we have a third REC objective, which is driving continuous improvements and efficiencies. So that's both in terms of the operation of the REC, but also the REC services in which the REC governs. So in pursuit of those objectives, we have a number of key areas of focus that really guides the day-to-day operations here at RECCo. As you'd expect, a core focus is obviously the management and the evolving of the Retail Energy Code. And a big part of managing the REC is ensuring compliance and ensuring that the requirements of the REC are being met. So that includes our own responsibilities and meeting our own REC obligations. But we also have a responsibility for ensuring that our service providers and our service partners meet their obligations as part of delivering the suite of REC services. But equally important is your obligation. So REC parties, ensuring that REC parties meet their obligations as you interact with the retail energy market. So aside from the management of the REC and evolving the REC, another key focus for RECCo is the delivery of the suite of REC services. So on industry's behalf, we design, procure and oversee the quality delivery of REC services, which are really critical to the day-to-day running of the retail energy market. And I'm sure most of you are fully aware of the suite of REC services that we're responsible for and that are governed under the REC. But just picking up a few examples, there's the likes of the gas and electricity inquiry services that are used by thousands of users on a day-to-day basis, all the way through to our code manager service. And that's the support that REC parties interact with in terms of the REC arrangements and ensuring that REC parties meet their obligations under the Retail Energy Code. So aside from those 2 areas of focus, we also have our work programmes, and our work programmes are equally instrumental in aiding us to fulfil our REC objectives. Annually, and hopefully that you've seen as part of the last couple of months, in line with the requirements of the REC, we develop and consult on an annual strategy and forward work plan, which we publish and seek input from our stakeholder community as part of the annual consultation cycle. And it's within this document that our proposed work programmes outline our various different areas that we are seeking to address in terms of industry's feedback. So that's now, and also as we look to the horizon and we plan to the future. But really importantly, it's how RECCo will address key industry issues that we're called upon increasingly to take forward. And recent examples are like the administering of the energy market schemes, such as the market stabilisation charge, and also the forthcoming prepayment meter levelisation scheme. So that's our key responsibilities at RECCo. How do we deliver those? So if we look at our operating model, and I can briefly describe that, we primarily operate under an outsourced delivery framework. And it's really important that I emphasise here that as part of that framework, we prioritise both accountability, but also striving for excellent service standards that you expect from us, but also that we expect from ourselves. And it's really important, again, here to deliver that framework, that we have really strong and collaborative partnerships with our service providers. But equally important, it's the engagement that we have with you as our stakeholders and our service users. So we're continually gaining feedback, not just on the quality and performance of our services, but also understanding the evolving needs of you as our stakeholders and users. And it's that feedback loop that helps us promptly address the issues when they arrive, but also helps us prioritise as an organisation what our agenda needs to be as we move forward. So I just wanted to briefly reflect on the feedback and that we've had over the course of the year and through our various different engagement channels. And I think it's fair to say that the last year was a significant milestone for RECCo. We completed our first year of operating our full suite of services. So that obviously followed retail consolidation, but also the go live of our switching programme. And I think it's fair to say that as an organisation that we've made notable progress and our services are collectively valued by our stakeholder community. But at the same time, we recognise that there are areas for improvement, and there are also clear priorities that we need to address and take forward as we move into 24 to 2025. So I'm hoping that helps set the stage for our next session. Elizabeth's going to be providing some further information on how we're directly addressing stakeholder feedback that we've heard over the course of the year, as we deliver against our key strategic priority for the year ahead, which is delivering service excellence. So I'll invite Elizabeth to take forward the next slides. Good to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see so many of you here today, and thanks again for giving up your time to spend an hour or so with us this morning. As Rachel said, the feedback we've had through the Forward Work Plan webinar was that you would like to hear a bit more detail about how we intend to deliver the core services this year. So I'm just going to detail some of the changes and the enhancements that you as users of the service will be able to benefit from in the coming 12 months. As Rachel said, there'll be a Q&A session at the end of my presentation. So if anything occurs to you as I'm talking, please do just drop it into the Q&A panel, or at the end of the session, you can pop your hand up and I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have. If we move on then, thank you, Jenny. So if you're on this call today, you're likely to be a recipient of one or more of the RECC services, although I see we've got a lot of the RECC service providers on the call today as well, so it may be that you're responsible for delivering them. RECCo is required within the code to either provide or procure or manage the services that you see on the screen in front of you now. And these are the services that support the delivery of your obligations and your business processes in the retail market. The budget that we've put together for the RECC services this year focuses on two elements. It's the continued delivery and improvement of the existing services, and it's also the preparation and evolution of those services to meet future needs. And you'll appreciate that whenever we're looking at the delivery and the enhancement of the services, that there's a balance that we need to strike between short-term maintaining, reducing costs, but also that longer-term investment. And we take that balance and that consideration into all of the elements of the work that we do when we think about when and how to build and deliver those services. If we move on then, And the first set of services that I'd like to talk to you about, well, let me just pause. Oh, okay, I don't know if my slides are slightly slower than everybody else's, but the first area we're going to start with this morning is the RECCo Code Manager services, and probably the majority of the interactions that you have with the RECC will go through the Code Manager services, be that through the RECC portal, the service desk, the interaction that you have with your operational account managers, or through the processes like the change process or the performance assurance framework. And because there's such a high dependency and need for this Code Manager service, it's really important that we get it right. And we're focusing particularly in this coming year on making the changes and improvements that you've fed back to us that you need. So what we've done is we've agreed improvement plans across the Code Manager services. We've identified the areas that we want to change. We have set out timeframes for when those changes will be delivered. And we've also identified relevant metrics so that we can measure whether or not we're achieving the ambitions that we've set out for ourselves. These changes will be deployed over the course of the coming year, but actually in many cases work has already begun. So what can you expect to see? Where will you see these changes? So we're boosting and increasing the operational account manager service. We receive excellent feedback about the quality of the resource within that team, but there's just not enough people to meet your needs. We're focusing on the service desk, so upskilling that kind of first line support so that more questions can be answered at the first point of contact, and also looking at the routing so that if your queries do need to be passed through to specialist second line support, that happens more quickly and in a smoother way for you. We're looking at improvements to change, so that includes boosting the change team, making sure that that detailed industry knowledge is properly invested in that team, and then also thinking about how we communicate changes to you, the establishment or the maintenance of those industry groups that we know you value, such as the RECC Issues Group and operational forums. In terms of the digital services, so thinking about the RECC portal and the digital navigator, there's those kind of self-serve areas where you can get information from you. We know from the feedback that we've received and from the stakeholder advisory group that we've set up that there are some issues, particularly you've highlighted navigation, ease of accessing the information that you need, improvements, straightforward improvements to the landing page so that when you land on the RECC portal, you can easily find where the information you need and where to go. And also more of a consistent look and feel across those suite of digital products that we have. So we've got a pipeline of change there in that digital space to roll out over the coming year. And then finally, when we look at the performance assurance elements of the service, really targeting on making sure that that is focused, that it's appropriate, and that it's properly communicated to you. We've got 5 themes within the improvement plan for performance assurance, and they're communication, to make sure you get the information that you need in a way that's accessible to you, education, both within the Code Manager service and also out to you as industry, so you can understand the purpose of the activities that are taking place, improved reporting, process improvements, and there's also an area looking at theft within the performance assurance framework, and I'll come on to that separately in just a moment. So those are the improvements and key areas of focus that we're looking to make across the Code Manager services this year. If we can move on to the next slide, thank you. So now we're going to look at the inquiry services, the gas inquiry service and the electricity inquiry service, providing, as Rachel mentioned earlier, critical services to thousands of people on a daily basis. These services transitioned from existing governance arrangements to RECCo in 2022. And since that point, we've been evolving those services to meet the changing user needs. So last year in particular, we looked at opening up access to that data to make it easier for people to get access to the data within the inquiry services. And I'm really pleased to say that satisfaction remains very high with these services. We know that they are delivering in a way that industry wants. But at the same time, we have actually identified a number of changing trends And that's particularly around how the inquiry services are used and accessed, the types of user wanting access to the data, and there's definitely been an increased demand as well for those services. So this year, that's what we're really focusing on, working very closely with those service providers. On the GES, there's a replatforming activity taking place on the back end, so no sort of activities for you to undertake, but that will increase efficiency within the GES. And on the EES, really focusing on enhanced reporting and availability to make sure that those services continue to deliver for you in the way that you need. If we move on to another area of the RECC services that we look after, so if we start with theft, as you'll be well aware by now, I'm sure, it continues to be a key focus for us. It's incredibly important that we continue to make people aware of the dangers of meter tampering, and also to continue to work with industry to see how we can detect and prevent theft. So the work that we did last year was quite a lot of discovery phases, analysis, to really understand across the suite of initiatives that we have within the RECC for dealing with theft, where we should be focusing the most of our effort, where we'd get the most impact from an investment. And this year we'll be implementing the changes that we learnt last year through that analysis. So we're building on the existing services. We're investing in the marketing that we have, as I say, to make consumers aware of the dangers of energy theft. There's improvements being made to the Crime Stoppers Stay Energy Safe website. And we'll continue to invest in those expert forums that we've established where we can work with you to understand other techniques that we can implement to prevent and detect theft. The second area then on this slide is around metering. So I think it was spring of last year, we implemented the consolidated metering code of practice and also the new audit regime. It's really important when you put any changes in that you then measure to see whether they're working, how the service is being received. So we've been carrying out a post-implementation review, and that has told us that we do need to make some changes to that document to make sure the obligations are targeted at the right parts of the industry community. And so we'll be raising a change and implementing that this year to make the improvements we need to make to the ComCop and any changes to the audit regime as a result of that. And then if we move forward, thank you, Jenny. So the final RECC service that I wanted to speak to you about this morning is the switching service, slightly different from the other RECC services in that RECCo isn't responsible for the delivery of the switching service. That obviously sits with DCC under the license arrangements. But the service is governed within the RECC, so the requirements are set out in the RECC, in the schedules, in the service definition, and also the service level agreements within the code. So RECCo has a critical role here, working with the DCC to make sure that all elements of the service, from the system through to the switching operator role, are delivered in line with the service definition and the required service levels. And so been working collaboratively with the DCC to identify areas for improvement based on our learnings over the last 12 months. We've identified changes that we would like to make to the change process itself to make sure that when a change is raised, all the way from initial impact assessment through to delivery, that's happening in a timely way to the required quality standards, and also a particular focus on incident management. So working with the DCC on a range of actions. I think there was 24 actions shared across RECCo and the DCC coming out of our P1 incident review to mitigate the likelihood of a recurrence of any incidents, but also to make sure that if there are any incidents, the impact is minimised and they're dealt with in the best way to reduce the impact of any incidents on yourselves. So that was a whistle-stop tour through the changes and enhancements we want to make to the services this year. We want to continue to meet with you across the coming year to report our progress to you and to seek your feedback. We really do want to hold ourselves to account, so it's important that we have the opportunity to continue to hear your feedback as we trial, test, adjust and implement these improvements over the coming year. So if you're not already part of our advisory groups. If you're not already finding a way to feedback, then if you'd like to have a further conversation, please do leave your details or contact us directly, and we can follow up in more detail. Until that point, I will pause now to see if there are any questions. As I say, you can pop something into the Q&A panel or raise your hand if you'd like any further detail.
Yeah. So yeah, this is our first Q&A panel. So as Elizabeth said, if there's anything that we said that you'd like to talk to us about, this is your first chance for today. So please, you can type in any questions in the Q&A function, or just raise your hands and we can have a bit of a chat. Nothing at the moment, but I'll give it another minute. Don't worry if you'd rather listen to the budget, the main agenda item for today, and ask your questions at the end. There's an opportunity to do so later. We just wanted to make sure if there was anything that you weren't unsure of, we could answer those questions in this session. Okay, nothing I've seen so far. I think we'll move on to the next session. So that is handing over to you, Brian.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Rachel and Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today. I know that it's a very busy schedule this time of the year for everyone. In January, we published our strategy and forward work plan. This set out our key objectives for the coming year, both for 24-25 and into the future. And Elizabeth has provided detail on how we're going to address one of those key objectives, delivering service excellence. That work will focus on the RECCo services which have been identified as needing improvement and the variety of sources where we identify that need for improvement from. Alongside this, we will continue to plan for the delivery of RECCo services and RECCo policy for the long term to meet the changing needs of the market and also to meet the changing needs of the RECCo stakeholders. And the following slides will now set out our resources and discuss the resources required by RECCo for 2024-25. Thank you. Just give everyone a moment just to read the slide. There's a lot of information on there. The RECCo's role is to ensure the proper, effective and efficient management and importantly, the evolution of the RECCo. This includes delivering RECCo services which are economic, efficient and that meet user needs. That's very important elements. Our strategy reflects the functions and duties assigned under the RECCo, as well as other activities considered by the board to further the RECCo objectives, and the RECCo objectives are set out in licence. The board considers that all the activities set out in this budget will further those objectives, particularly in the areas of ensuring customer interests are protected and the continuous improvement and efficiencies are driven in the operation of the RECCo and the systems and communication infrastructure it governs. So that spans all of those RECCo services that Elizabeth mentioned. But we are very cognizant we are spending industry and consumers' money. Therefore, we use a recognisable, our processes will be very similar to processes that all of you guys will use in your organisations, structured and stringent financial scrutiny and control process to develop the budget. And part of that process includes publishing our budget to enable RECCo party scrutiny and challenge. In summary, our budget for the coming year reflects a focusing of internal resource capability on addressing RECCo service areas which require improvement, delivering our increased service delivery obligations, and delivery of key programs to meet RECCo service users' current and future needs, as well as acting on instruction from Ofgem. And that's particular to one particular project, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So Jenny, if you could move on, please. So the consultation process. The RECCo board is required to consult on its proposed strategy, including its indicative costs. The RECCo says that we have to do it. We consulted on the strategy and forward work plan in January 2024. We received one response, and that response was from DCC. That response covered two areas, but we'll concentrate. One of those areas was associated with the strategy, and one wasn't. So we'll concentrate here on the one that was associated with the strategy, and that was concerning DCC performance improvement and CRS transfer project. The board met in February and fully considered the comments, and the board considered that for DCC's performance improvement element, that the approach set out in the budget is fair and reasonable, and the approach set out in the strategy is fair and reasonable, and it absolutely aligns with the company policy, as mentioned by Elizabeth earlier, of holding service providers accountable for their performance. The REC sets out the performance metrics for which the CRS must meet. Then turning to the CRS transfer project, the board believes that the allowance meets the REC objective of protecting customers' interests, and the budget allowance is required to deliver against the Ofgem requirements set out in its DCC review phase 1 decision published in August 2023. So that's very much a sort of a bit of a history associated with the publication of the strategy and forward work plan and the comments and the process the board went through to meet its obligations to consider those comments. Now, turning to the budget, REC parties can appeal the board's decision to approve the budget to Ofgem. Any appeal must be submitted by the 6th of March, and the REC sets out in section 9 the process and criteria for raising appeal and the assessment criteria which Ofgem will use when considering the appeal. But that is open to REC parties, and that meets our obligation to transparency and openness and consultation with REC parties. So I see the slide for budget overview is our financial overview is on the screen. So, as I said, the budget includes the resources to address the service areas which need improvement, as well as planning for the future. Our 24-25 budget is just over 53 million, so it's 53.05 million. We have scrutinised all proposed spends, and we have worked with service providers to ensure they deliver value for money in their forward projections. For example, we scrutinised the CRS budget through December and January, and we secured through dialogue with DC material cost reductions in that proposed initial draft budget. This approach of scrutinising each element of spend and working with our service providers means that we can deliver a 2.5 million reduction, which is about 5%, on the indicative costs we expected to incur for 24-25 that we published in last year's business plan. We're proposing a modest increase in our internal resources. That's primarily that increased headcount to match new obligations, as well as economic decisions within the organisation to transition people from contractor roles into employee roles, and that delivers savings for industry. It also ensures that we retain knowledge in the organisation and protects the organisation for the future. In the coming year, we have obligations to a number broader of industry and Ofgem programmes or new work obligations, for example, MHHS, tariff levelisation, as well as the CRS project, which Ofgem has asked us to consider. And our budget includes resources for us, excuse me, to continue to deliver on that. We're also looking to the longer term beyond March 2025 and considering the future code manager services evolution and also the inquiry services evolution, and the budget sets out some details there around the work that we're going to do over the coming year. In 24-25, we will continue to manage costs in a very prudent way, and we believe our track record demonstrates that we do this either through reductions in budgets or management of budgets and the ability to provide rebates to parties. This is very much a factual slide. It's very much a reproduction of what's in the budget that's been published, but just some information around how we will invoice our charges. So we'll recover them evenly across the year. We will invoice in the first month of each quarter. We will separate out the MHHS charges from the REC charges, because then that will allow parties to consider whether those MHHS costs can be capitalised under IAS 38 as an intangible asset within their business. We will also continue to invoice non-REC parties for access to the services, and we're just completing a piece of work to ensure that those charges are fair and reasonable, and that'll be completed by the end of March 24. Distribution businesses, the electricity distribution businesses will continue to make a contribution to the electricity inquiry service, and that is the transition of a historic charging methodology that was included in the MRA. What we also do is we are very proactive about credit control, that the charges to the REC are on a socialisation basis, and it's very important that each party pays its costs and pays its costs on time to relieve the burden on other parties of funding those elements. If we can move to the next slide. Thank you. The REC services, they absolutely represent the bulk of the budget for the coming year. They are primarily and almost exclusively contracted outsourced services to third parties. And it's contracted with a small c, in that we would include in that the CRS, because the REC is essentially the contract for the delivery of those services. The REC services are essential to the efficient operation of the retail energy market. They're essential to delivering consumer benefits, and also essential to ensuring the REC parties can discharge their regulatory obligations. What we have done is we have sought wherever possible to negotiate fixed cost contracts, which are fixed for initial term, which then would increase by indexation in any extended terms. That explains some of the uplifts that you can see in years 2 and 3. We are entering the third year of full operation of the REC services, and consequently we're coming to the end of the initial term on a number of those contracts, so we will see indexation impacts flowing through in years 2 and 3. As mentioned earlier, we hold all REC service providers to account for performance. Each contract has service levels set out in it, and where applicable, those service levels have liquidated damage service credits associated with them. Regardless of the failure of a service level, or regardless of the value of the service payable or recoverable by RECCo, we collect it. We don't set a de minimis limit. That is a very important principle that we have to establish, that we hold the service providers to account. We don't introduce kind of arbitrary subjective arrangements. Service levels are met or they are not met. For the coming year, we will use active supplier management to get the REC service performance back on track. We will use all hard and soft levers available to us in the contracts to do that. Looking to the longer term, our projections, and you can see in years 2 and 3, our projections include allowances for new TEF services coming on stream. Like any new service that's been introduced by RECCo, these have to be supported by a positive business case and have to demonstrate they will deliver value for the REC service users. If we can move to the next slide, please. So RECCo operations primarily covers our operating costs, day-to-day operating costs, printers, postage, stationery, audit fees, insurance, etc., as well as our resource costs and our independent board of directors costs. We've got a recognisable corporate and operational structure. We've got functions within the business, and they would align to functions within your own business: strategy and development, operations, finance, commercial, transformation, etc. We adopted, despite being a non-profit making organisation, we adopt a commercial approach to how we run the company. All the businesses that we deal with, except for Crime Stoppers, who is a charity, are commercial organisations, and it's important that we stand up to them in a commercial manner and deal with them in a commercial way. Our current model reflects some of the key characteristics of good governance that are being proposed elsewhere in the industry. There's a webinar going on at the same time as this, associated with the future of DCC. And it identifies some of the key governance principles that will be implemented in that function, or DCC version 2.0 for the future. For example, stakeholder-led governance processes. The REC change process is stakeholder-led. Any additional services have to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, subject to stakeholder views. Any new REC services being introduced have to be done through the REC change process. We have an independent board of directors with independent non-executive directors, and their accountability is to the stakeholders, e.g. the REC parties and other REC stakeholders, rather than RECCo shareholders. We have a focus on service delivery and performance for the benefit of customers and ultimately consumers. We have upfront approval of costs. That's what we are doing today, and that's what we will be doing up to the 6th of March through the publication of the budget, and also a strong customer engagement element to ensure consultation and scrutiny, and that's demonstrated through the REC change process and also regarding in our stakeholder engagement. So there are some of the key characteristics of RECCo and how we operate. Since the full suite of REC services went live in summer 2022, with the two final ones that came on was the gas inquiry services and CRS, and also the enhanced electricity inquiry services. Since then, our remit has expanded. Rachel mentioned earlier the market stabilisation charge and the soon to be introduced from 1st of April tariff levelisation. The nature of the services that we provide and we are responsible for influence the level and nature and type of REC resources that we require internally. And we have seen that change over the last couple of years. We've sized our operational capacity and capability to deliver successful services. We will man-mark our service providers. We will address the areas that need improvement. We will deliver transformation and change. We will enhance our stakeholder engagement. And of course, we have to discharge all of our corporate obligations. We are a limited liability company. We are required to comply with legislation. Our operating costs remain largely stable, and they represent about 11% of our total budget. If we can move to the next slide, please. So these are our programs and projects for the coming year. We've identified several key programs and they're listed on there, and there's a full list provided for open and transparency. It is our belief that all of these further the REC objectives and deliver either an industry, a REC, a legal obligation or an Ofgem requirement. So it ticks at least one of those boxes. Any new regulatory obligations that come on board in 24-25 would be funded from the contingency allowance. That's what it's there for. Delivering industry programme obligations, for example, MWHS, represents 55% of our overall project budget, and we separate it from our REC services, and that allows us to invoice it separately, and it will allow parties to capitalise it if that's their proper accounting treatment within their organisation. Looking to the future, we need to consider the code manager services of the future and the costs in year, and we have got an allowance in to cover our project activities in 24-25, and you can see a significant uptick in those costs in years 2 and 3. They are provided at this stage purely for information and early sight for parties. As part of our programme in 24-25, we will consult with industry and we will validate those costs. And again, those costs will only be incurred if there's a positive business case. Looking to the inquiry services and recognising what Elizabeth said earlier about how crucial they are to the operation of the market, we considered economically and risk advantageous to offer our current inquiry service providers the opportunity to present compelling proposals for long-term extensions of their contracts. I would say that in the event that we don't get those compelling programs for long-term extensions beyond their current terms, the timescales do allow us to conduct a full procurement activity. So we have that optionality should we wish to use it. For the coming year, our TEF projects will primarily focus on the evolution of existing initiatives. And the final one I want to address is the CRS transfer project. The allowance that we've included in there purely covers expected work to the date of the Ofgem decision, and that is expected to be in September 2024. In August 23, as part of its review of the Smart DCC licence, Ofgem identified the potential for the transfer of responsibility for the delivery of CRS from DCC to RECCo. Ofgem planned to consult in this in spring 24, and we expect they'll issue a consultation in possibly April, in the coming April. And aligned to this, Ofgem has asked both DCC and RECCo to provide information to support that activity. As part of the comments received on the forward work plan, the board revisited the budgetary allowance included in the 24-25 budget. They consider it to be appropriate, they consider it to be reasonable, and they consider it to be necessary to develop a full and diligent response to Ofgem's consultation. That work will cover all the necessary analysis to support RECCo's response, and it'll also look at the including any mitigations associated with transitional risks. As is the case with all RECCo projects, we will only spend the money if we are required to do, and any underspend against the budget will be absolutely returned to the REC parties as part of any rebate. We also expect that DCC will be fully engaged in a comparable process over the same timescale. So if we can move to the final slide, thank you. Final slide covers two areas. It covers change allowance and contingency. So the first one is the change allowance. So as Elizabeth outlined earlier, we're looking at improving the efficiency of the REC change process, and we expect that improvement to flow through to efficiency in 24-25. That will enable more efficient and timely change being pushed through the change process. It'll also enable the backlog of change to be cleared. The change allowance that we include in the budget is to fund the cost of changes to REC services. So if we need to upgrade the inquiry service as a result of a REC change, that's where the funding will be drawn from. Similar for CRS, similar for ETOS, similar for all the other REC services. For the coming year, we have maintained the allowance at the expected level. The contingency, excuse me. We prepare our budget on a bottom-up basis. The REC compels us to do that. We don't just take last year's costs and add 5%. We go through each individual budget line and we assess the requirement for the spend. We have not included in any of the projects or any of the specific budget allowances any individual contingency or risk premiums. The overall company level contingency, which is 3.7% of our total budget, its role is twofold. Firstly, to hedge against any future regulatory requirements developed by DESNZ or Ofgem. For example, a new regulatory requirement akin to, say, tariff levelisation coming from Ofgem, and also to mitigate any inherent uncertainty in the market. That's the end of my slides. I'd just like to thank everyone for your time today, and now we're going to open the floor to questions.
Yeah, so we've had a couple of questions coming in, so thank you very much to those that have come in. You've still got a chance to raise any questions. So again, just a bit of a reminder, you can use the Q&A function if you'd rather type them in. But if you'd rather speak to us directly, just raise your hand and we can bring you on microphone. The first question we had, Elizabeth, I think one for you. It's from Kirsty. So hi, Kirsty. Your message said, you mentioned changing the ComCop document and targeting better. Are you reviewing the process and communications for the audits as well, i.e. the service provision element?
Thanks, Kirsty. Thank you for the question. Short answer is yes. So we've had the feedback directly from parties and also through the customer satisfaction survey that we ran at the back end of last year. Those results will be published shortly, but exactly as you've highlighted, some of the areas that didn't score as highly as we would like or expect were around the quality of the communications from the service provider and also the flexibility. So we're making changes to the ComCop where we know that essentially some of the obligations aren't pointing into the right places, and we'll also be working with the service provider to make improvements to the audit process itself and the interaction with you as parties. Does that address your question, Kirsty? If you don't want to come on camera, you can just do I don't know if there's a thumbs down, but hopefully that answers your question.
A reaction.
Okay, if not, pop something else into the chat and I can come back to it.
Okay.
Thanks.
I think we've had another question come in, but I think the next two questions are for you, Brian. So we had a question from Alex. So hi, Alex. The question from Alex was, you mentioned that projects only get to go ahead if there's a positive business case. Do parties get to see and challenge individual cases?
I'm afraid I'm going to have to give it depends answer in this one. So, for example, positive business cases through the RECCo change process that will be carried out through the RECCo change process and involve the assessment of any impact assessments, and those impact assessments will go to service providers who are providing the RECCo services and or go to industry. So in that case, that's essentially the business case that will be presented, and then there will be an assessment. Again, I'm not an expert on the RECCo change process, so please correct me if I'm wrong at any point, Elizabeth. Then that assessment will be considered by the code manager independently of RECCo as to whether that would deliver positive benefit and further the RECCo objectives. And if it does, that gets taken ahead. As regards our internal projects, I think the emphasis on the word internal there. And some projects, for example, MHHS, it has been written into the BSc that the project cannot be challenged or any of the work cannot be challenged on the basis of economic reasons or affordability. So actually, in that case, we are compelled to spend the money to the extent. That does not mean that we give our service providers carte blanche. We will challenge all of their proposed costs if there is going to be an impact to our services. On other particular business cases and on projects, we have a standard recognizable project management process in place where there is a project proposal put forward and that is assessed. There is a project brief put forward and that is assessed. And then only if they meet the criteria would that be approved to go ahead. The existence of the money in the budget does not mean an automatic spend. On business cases, we don't publish them because they are wholly internal documents, and also they will include certain commercial and confidential information. By publishing them, I mean we breach our obligations under the RECCo, and we may also breach our obligations under contracts. So it's a bit of 50-50. Some are, some aren't.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, Alex, for any of our programs, we also have supporting engagement plans that we develop. So we look at keeping stakeholders engaged throughout the life cycle of a project. So that includes the likes of webinars to make sure that we're engaging with you and getting your feedback on any initiatives that we're developing. But we'll also from time to time do consultations. So you might have seen last year when we were developing our data and digitalisation strategy and looking at areas like the API gateway, we did a consultation on that to make sure that we're looking at the right areas and there was industry buy-in on those type of initiatives. So hopefully that answers your question, Alex. If there's anything else you want to say, please do raise your hand or raise another question in the Q&A function. That was that question. Brian, another one for you from Kirsty. How do you arrive at the change allowance and in particular the contingency figure? How do these compare against last year and the spend against them?
Thank you. I would imagine how we arrive at it is fairly tortuous for some of my colleagues with the amount of challenge that I raise. But where we get to on those is, so if we look at the two different, if we look at them separately, so the change allowance, for example, we included last year. So in our current budget, we had a similar value, about £4 million. We are going to spend or commit just over 2 million of that in this current year, and that spend is reflective of the fact that we've had some blockages in the change process. And our working assumption is that if we had a fully efficient change process And if we had responsiveness from from our service providers, not necessarily those under direct contract, but elsewhere, we would have spent significantly more of that change allowance in this current financial year. Consequently, we have a backlog for change, and therefore we have maintained the allowance for next year. So it could be argued, and I did argue to say, is if we're only spending 2 million in this current year, why do we need 4 million next year? But the argument was presented, and I was convinced by the argument that we've improved the efficiency in the change process. We have backlog. We expect to spend it in the coming year. On the contingency allowance, we would look again. We look at that from a bottom-up basis, and we determine it's how valid is it in the context of the market instability at the moment? And if we go back to kind of 21, 22, where we had a lot of instability in the market and a significant number of suppliers going bust, again, the contingency was there was a much more prudent approach taken to that, to ensuring in the budget we had the contingency to mitigate against that. That to some degree has eased off over the last 2 years. For example, our bad debts in this current year, in fact, we're in a positive negative position with bad debts, in that we have recovered money back from those parties that have went bust. But nonetheless, for the allowance in 24 in the current year, again, that was set at 2 million, we are expecting to spend about between 75 to 80% of that year, and that is driven by those new regulatory obligations that have been put on RECCo. We expect a similar pattern to continue for the future, where we Ofgem are developing new policy to introduce further stability or levelization or whatever into the marketplace, and they look to deliver that through RECCo, given our operational delivery history. That, I just want to be clear, and I don't know if Ofgem are on this call or not, but as our CEO says, that doesn't mean they click their fingers and we jump. We will challenge and determine whether that should be, one, is the RECCo an appropriate place for that policy, and two, are we the appropriate organisation to deliver that particular function? It's not just a kind of, they don't just go, here, catch, and we go, catch. Again, I hope there's a thumbs up on that one. I hope that answers your question, Kirsty.
We've had Alex has come back asking for giving a bit of context and an example to the previous question, Brian. So it says, I don't understand what the positive case is for the 415k spent on the gateway, and 7 million for the code manager procurement seems incredible. So if we could explain that a little bit more for Alex.
So on the first one is, again, this is a budget allowance for the gateway. It's the API gateway, and we have been looking at the API gateway and the introduction of an API gateway over probably the last 12 months. And the concept of the API gateway is that it will improve. And again, I'm not a technologist, so please take some of what I say with a pinch of salt and check with your technologist in your organization. The concept of the introduction of an API gateway will, one, be a key stepping stone in the delivery of our data and digitalization strategy, which we have published. That looks to move to a microservices architecture, and the introduction of an API gateway in front of our services, and there is multiple services and multiple components within those services, that will improve the overall efficiency of the access of parties to those services, enhance security, enhance validation, enhance, I can't remember the other one, there's another one, to make sure it's the right person accessing the right thing, and also improve the availability of the services to parties. So the project that we have got as the next phase is we are looking at the technologies that are available, and to some degree, and I know that technologists in our organisation would shout at me, but they are kind of commodity product, and there are specialist organisations that provide it. And this project will look at what is the best technology that we want, and then what is the process of its alignment to the first positive business case for its introduction. Again, I would say that just because we have the budget allowance within it, that is not an automatic right for the project team to spend that money. We have gateways in place to support any spend against it. And what we also have is a very, very explicit scheme of delegated authority, which extends into authorities within SROs and within steercos to spend approved budget. Then looking at the 7 million for the code manager procurement, it's in there for transparency. That is not spending £7 million on a project. We're not going to have £7 million worth of project managers or technical analysts or business analysts. In there is potential mobilization costs associated with any new procurement activity in the future. But again, that is in year 2, and as part of our work in the coming year, we will absolutely be validating those figures.
Hopefully that's answered your question, Alex. If you want someone from our data and digitalisation team to speak to you a little bit more about our API Gateway project, please just drop us a note. We can set up a call if that would be helpful as well. Oh, I think Alex is raised his hand. Okay, that's gone down now. This thumbs up, brilliant. There's still a chance to ask any more questions. I don't see any more coming in. Jenny's going to be launching a poll in a moment just to understand how useful you found today and giving you an opportunity to provide any feedback in terms of what you'd like to see from us and the executive team going forward. So if you can spend filling that in, that'd be much appreciated. I don't see any other questions coming in, but that doesn't mean that you can't still have questions answered by the team. Brian's put his email on the last slide, so if you've got any budget specific questions, please do reach out directly to Brian. Otherwise, you can come through to RECCo using our usual mailbox, which is info@retangco.co.uk, and we can set something up and speak to you about any questions that you have. I guess the last bit from me really is in terms of next steps. So as I said at the beginning of the webinar, we have been recording today. We will be sharing the recording as well as the full slide deck, and we'll write up any questions and answers that we had today, and we'll share those with you hopefully by the end of tomorrow. And of course, if you did find today useful, please do go and share the recording of the webinar or the slides with other colleagues. But yes, I think that's all from us today. I wanted to say a really big thank you for joining us today. Hopefully you found it useful. We particularly did, and we definitely enjoy seeing the type of questions that you ask, and it really does help us think about our communications and our engagement with you going forward. So I think that's all from us. Want to just wish you a good rest of the day, and thanks very much, and I'll close today's session.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.